time we're finished, we'll be able to word it. But I started to think about the will of God. And Father, I just ask that you take your word, which is precious, your precious word. And I ask that you would just minister this word this morning, Lord God, to your people, those who are hearing this morning, and to me as well. I'm the first partaker of this word. I ask that you would deal your word as bread to your people, that we might eat and be satisfied, that it would be clear, that it would be precise, and that it will address the need that is present here today, and that you would be glorified in all that is said and done, in Jesus' precious name. And everybody said, Amen. So I was thinking about the will of God a few weeks back, and I began to see like a picture of this, and a lot of times that's what happens with me. I can see different things, and I started seeing God's will as a locomotive, so to speak. That was what was coming to me, because I began to realize that without God's will in our lives, each of our lives, there is not a connection. When we don't connect to God's will, certain things cannot connect. This thing will not start to move to connect to this other thing which starts to move, which connects to a third thing or a fourth thing which continues moving, and then the whole thing starts moving. So I'm going to try to bring out what I've been seeing, and of course, relate it to the scriptures. To understand what God's will is, we have to know what it is. We can't just say, well, believe that everybody knows what we're talking about when we say, if it's God's will, and this is God's will, and that is God's will, and I'm doing this according to God's will. So what is God's will? So to understand what God's will is, it means we have to first understand that His will is always focusing on His desire and His plan for our lives, for mankind. What is His will? What He is wanting. Right? If you get up and you say, I will do this today, that means that you're desiring to do this today. That's your plan. That's what I'm going to do today. So God has a will for mankind. He didn't just say, let me create Adam and Eve and just throw them out there and just let them do the best they can. I'll check in with them sometime to see how they're doing. But He made us with a plan, with a will. He has a will for every single life. Every single life. Your life and my life. Now, when our will, which is our desires, our aspirations, our plans, etc., when our will connects with God's will, something divine takes place. So that tells me that somebody could be living on the face of this earth for 10, 15, 20, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years and still hasn't connected to God's will. It's not automatic to say, well, because God created us, that we're going to just line up with His will. It's something that is, we have a free will. The Bible tells us. He said, God so loved the world, right, that whosoever believes in Him should not perish. But it doesn't mean that He's going to come and say, well, you're all going to believe in me. He's given us a free will. It's our choice. Do we choose Him? Do we choose another God? Do we choose not to believe in anything? So we can be living on this earth with our will, just walking around, doing our own thing, living, and God's will can be right there, and there's no connection because we have not submitted to His will or asked Him to, connect our will with His will. That hasn't happened. So when our will, our desires, our aspirations, our plans connect with God's will, when we say, okay, oh, so I'm not walking here by myself doing my own thing. Oh, there is a will of God to connect to, just like how everything here is connected, if you notice. And we have power. This is connected to something. If I disconnect this, then I won't have any volume, right? This gives me the volume. So there's a connection. When we connect with God's will, our will connects with God's will, there's a connection. Something divine takes place. And it sets things into motion in our lives like a locomotive. That's what was coming to me, Mr. Garnet. And locomotive means a self-propelled vehicular, that's like a vehicle, engine, powered by steam, a diesel, or electricity, for pulling or pushing a train or individual railroad cars, right? And the general definition of a locomotive is the engine of a train or relating to movement or the ability to move. So it sometimes is applied to the movement of our bodies. We're in locomotion, you know, in one of these things, right? So I am going to have my husband, who is so good with this technical stuff.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I had him when I finished writing this one morning, which was Wednesday morning or Thursday morning. I just got up early and I wrote the whole thing by the grace of God from what he was showing me. And so I handed him the book and I said, look this over. And he said, oh. And I'm waiting to hear what he has to say. And so as soon as I was saying locomotive and he started saying something, I said, read further. And I have here that he will explain locomotion. He said, So I'm going to have him tell us, give me your expertise and your technical.
Locomotion, no locomotive. Well, I looked at like she did at a slightly different aspect from what she looked up. I looked up loco. Loco means, in Latin, means from a place, right? And motion or motivus is causing motion.
Latin?
Yes. So self-propelled power train, like she said. So when you think of this, of the locomotive, you know, it's a train. It's a train that pulls all the cars, or whether it be products or people, right? So it begins to move. So that size is not easy to stop. So when you relate to God's will, if it's God's will, it's not going to stop. It's going to be hard to stop if it's God's will. Okay. Due to the weight of the locomotive, of the weight of His will. All right. So the average car, locomotive car with all the cars attached to it is about 48,000 pounds. So that is going to be very, very hard to stop. They say to stop a locomotive takes about 1 mile in order for it to start stopping to its stop. You can't just put a brake on it, something like a car, because of the way it's going to keep, the momentum is going to keep it going. It's like the momentum of God's will. It's going to keep going. It's going to keep. If it's God's will, it ain't going to stop that easy. It's going to be His will to stop it. It's going to keep going. And she also asked me to explain how everything fits with each other. So as in the engine of a locomotive or a car. So I start out with, it starts out with the gasoline. The gasoline goes into the combustion chamber along with oxygen, air. And those three things and the spark creates an explosion. The explosion creates a burst in the combustion chamber that propels pushes out the piston. That then the piston turns the crankshaft, and then the crankshaft starts turning, which is several of them. And locomotive is probably, I didn't look it up, it's several pistons. And that piston starts turning the crankshaft starts turning the connected to the transmission in a vehicle, and from the vehicle to the propeller, and from that to the it's not propeller, shaft, engine shaft to the wheels, and that allows it to start turning and gives it the motion, and that's where it's come with locomotion.
Okay, now, do you see why
Good morning.
Good morning. Do you see why I asked Wayne to
Yeah,
explain it?
right.
Okay, now you all understand that, don't you? I read that in the driver's manual, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna go to the car, I'm gonna open up the hood, and I'm gonna see where this camshaft and all of those things are. Um, did I understand all of that, Mr. Garnett? No. What I did understand is that this thing is causing this other thing to work, and this other thing is causing this thing to work, and everything is moving. And when I put the ignition, turn the, put the key in the ignition, I'm going to hear vroom, vroom, and it's going to start, and I'll be on my way, right? So, we're talking this morning about the will of God, ladies. And I know I might have to speak in Espanol, un poquito. But how the will of God, when we connect to God's will, su voluntad del Señor, when we connect to God's will, it sets things in motion. Just as he was explaining just now about how the, everything comes together with the locomotion, the things going into place. There's movement from one place to the next. I've been seeing this for some weeks now about how our lives will not move. We will not be going in a certain direction. Yes, we're walking around like this, going shopping, going to the bank, going to wherever, we're moving around, going to visit family, friends. We're moving that way, but we're not moving in the way that we would move if we're not connected to the will of God. Our will is not connected to the will of God. There's not that kind of movement that will take us into what he has planned for us, his purposes. Do you wish to sit next to her so you can tell her? You can talk because you don't have to social distance at home, so you might want to sit next to her. So we understand that. Okay. Without locomotion, without movement, as you heard, now the different things are connecting. This thing is starting up, and you hear about explosion and piston and camshaft and crankshaft and all that. Without all of these actually coming into play, guess what? Everything is at a standstill. So if these things are not turning around, happening when you go to start your car or your train, then guess what? There's what? No movement, no motion. So there are some examples in the Bible where people's wills connected with God's will and propelled things into motion. See, we're dealing with a propelling. That's what I kept seeing, a propelling. In fact, I kept hearing this. When a train starts up, it starts. And then when everything starts coming to, do I sound like a train? Un tren. And it's gone, merrily on its way, because of the propelling action. That's what I kept seeing. There are several examples in the Bible, but when I started with one of them, I decided I was just going to just do that one. And that one is Abraham. And Abraham, as you know, was the father of faith. El padre de fe, see? And this is such a great example. Abraham is such a great example. And we say sometimes, how could I even walk in Abraham's footsteps? This is the father of faith. I don't know. That's some big shoes to fill. But you know what? we can look at his life and we can take that as an example. There's several things in his life, but I'm going to deal with one aspect of it today. And in Genesis chapter 17, 1 to 8, I'm going to read that. Abraham was 85 years old prior to these verses. He was 85 years old when God told him that he would be blessing him and his seed would be like the sand on the seashore. And I don't know if anybody has been able to number the sand on the seashore, if you have tried. Out here at the beach across here. You've been here for how long, Mr. Garnett? Maybe about 100 years trying to count them?
Could be more.
More than 100 years trying to count each sand on the seashore. Each grain of sand. By the time you pick this one up and you put it here, that you have counted it, maybe the wind has taken it and it's just come right back into the ones you haven't counted. So he had got that, and of course, he ended up, because of, I guess, Sarah's unbelief at the time. She felt that she was so old. Just go and have relations with my handmaid, which still would be her child. That's how they did it back in those days. So he went in and had relations with Hagar, and Ishmael came forth. So, maybe it seems Abraham was thinking, Ishmael, maybe he's going to be my heir. He was 85 years old at that time. Now remember, God still promised him that his seed would be as the sand on the seashore, innumerable, can't number them. But that was not God's will. It was supposed to be from his own body, right? His seed. So in Genesis 17, can you see whatever? It says, Abraham, and when Abram, it was Abram first. Abram was 90 years old, so this is another 5 years. No, 99 years old, almost, 14 years later. Appeared, and when Abram was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. And I will make my covenant between me and thee. That's an agreement. And I will multiply thee exceedingly. And Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with thee, and thou shalt be a father of many nations. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham, for a father of many nations have I made thee. And I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. Okay. And it says, verse 6, and I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. Verse 7, and I will establish my covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee, in their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be a God unto thee, and to thy seed after thee. Verse 8 says, and I will give unto thee, and to thy seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Now, notice with me, in these 8 verses, there's something that you are hearing all the time. And if you want to go back to verse 1 and flip through, you can see. 6 times, there's a certain phrase that God uses in these 8 verses. Can anybody see what those are? I'll let you look through. 6 times he says it. Move to the next one. Anybody seen anything?
I will.
I will. Thank you. I will. 6 times in those 8 verses, God is saying, I will. So remember earlier I had mentioned that God's will is basically what he desires for mankind. His plan for mankind is his will. What he wills. This is what he's desiring. So he is basically telling Abraham, his name was changed to Abraham from Abram. He's saying, this is what I want for you. This is my will. How could Abraham connect with God's will? How could his will now, like the locomotive, how could it start to connect with God's will? How could that happen? What would be the propeller? What would be the thing that would be offsetting this or causing this connection to take place? So I can have my will and I can know what God's will is, but until I connect with his will, it's not going to happen. There's going to be a standstill in my life. I can be walking around, yes, but there's not going to be any locomotion in the spirit realm. Because my will is not connecting with his will. So how do I connect with his will? I recognize it. He has said it. He said it right here for Abraham in those 8 verses. I will do this, I will do that, I will do this, I will do that. So how can you and I, when we know that God is saying, I will, this is what I'm planning for you, how can you and I connect with God's will? What is the thing that's going to cause that whole thing to come into motion? Because I'm going to have to do that, right? Can't just say, oh, that's good, I have my will, and his will is out there. His will looks so lovely. Oh my, that's a nice will that he has for me. That's really good. But that will can stay right there and I'll keep my will. I'm not going to connect, right? But if I desire to connect with his will, so that his will be my will, then I'm going to have to do something about it. So Abraham, he heard all that God was saying. I will, I will. Oh, God said he will. What did he do? Verses 9 to 14 tell us what he did. He said, oh, okay, so I'm going to have to do a connection here. This caboose is going to have to connect with this other one, and that other one is going to have to connect with this. I'm going to have to do something to get this train moving, right? So verses 9 to 14, same chapter. Okay, want to read that for me, please, Minister Wayne.
And God said unto Abraham, Thou shalt keep my covenant, therefore thou and thy seed after thee in their generations. Mm-hmm. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. And you shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. And he that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man child in your generations. He that is born in the house, or bought with money, or of any stranger, which is not of thee, of thy seed. He that is born in thy house, and he that is bought with thy money, must needs be circumcised. And my covenant shall be in your flesh, for an everlasting covenant. And the circumcised man child whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised, that soul shall be cut off from his people. He hath broken my covenant.
Wow, that's a mouthful right there. Okay, so basically here, God is saying, I'm going to make an agreement with you. That was his requirement regarding circumcision, right? Now, that's not saying that, oh, so God wants me to be circumcised, and if I'm not circumcised. This was what he made with Abraham at that time. That was the agreement. And you know what? The whole act of circumcision here talks about cutting away the foreskin. It talks about spiritually, it's cutting away the flesh, the carnal man. That there's a side to us that is carnal, that is not godly. We were born in sin and shaped in iniquity, and we came out just desiring to sin, because our forefathers, Adam and Eve, fell into sin. So we are born with this. Through Jesus Christ, we are redeemed, and the carnal man does not have to take supremacy and be in control of us. Our spirit man can be in control over the carnal man. So that the circumcision here was literally the physical act that God was talking to Abraham about. So he was saying to Abraham here, in this instance, this is how you're going to connect with me. Your will connect with my will, because this is now, I'm saying, this is what I'm laying out. This is my covenant, my agreement. This is your agreement. We're going to come into agreement with this. Every family member of yours is going to be circumcised. Every servant of yours is going to be circumcised. Everybody in your household will be circumcised. And he was very, very clear about the fact that if someone was not circumcised, then that person would be cut off, basically, right? Would not be able to be a part of them. So there was a way now for Abraham to connect, for his will to connect with God's will. He could have said, what? Circumcision? Lord, you forgot that I was 99 years old? Lord, this is going to be hard. At my age, Lord, really? Can't you just ease me out? And what about all the other older men? Lord, Abraham didn't even say that. I don't even think he gave that one thought, really. You know why? He wanted to connect with God's will, so that there would be that motion, there would be that propelling action where his will connecting to God's will would begin to set into motion the plans that God had for his life, to bring him to his destiny. And he knew in his heart of hearts what God had called him to do. He knew, and he wanted to connect. So this is where the propeller comes in. When we say, okay, God has said this, his will is right there, my will is here. Wonderful, God's will. Your will looks really nice, God. It looks good out there. It looks good. It looks good, but I also want it, because your will is better. You know, the Bible says that his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. His ways are higher than our ways. If we don't believe that, we're going to feel that our will, the way we have been living, is wonderful. We don't see the need for a change. We don't see the need to connect with God's will. If we don't see it, then we're going to let his will just stay right there, and our will be right here. But when we want to get to that place where we want to see his will, which is greater than our will, when we want to see the outworking, the like the train, when we want to get things moving, when we want to see the propelling action of God in our lives, we're going to connect with him. So there are also some more I wills in verses 15 to 22. Wow, God is just giving out those I wills. He's very, very generous, isn't he? Very generous. So verses 15 to 22, you see that on there. It says, Same chapter, Genesis chapter 17, verses 15 to 22. God dishes out some more I wills because he's not a stingy God. He loves to bless his people. He really does. He loves to give us promises, and he doesn't make empty promises either. You know, some people make some promises, and you kind of wonder sometimes because those promises are not fulfilled, and you're disappointed and frustrated. Right? But God doesn't do that. So in verse 15, it says, "And God said unto Abraham, As for Sarai," she was Sarai in the beginning, "thy wife, thou shalt not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. Shall her name be. And I will bless her," verse 16, "and I will give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her." Then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed, and said in his heart, "Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear?" And Abraham said unto God, I might be going a little, let's see, what did I say to 22? Yes. "And Abraham said unto God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." Remember, he had Ishmael when he was 85 years old with Sarah's handmaiden, Hagar. So, you know, he's thinking, boy, Lord, this is a little far-fetched here. Next year when you say Sarah is going to have a child, I'm going to be 100, Lord. She is going to be, 90 then? Lord, it's just let Ishmael be the heir. Could that work? Okay. So he's kind of bargaining with God right here. So he said, "Shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old, and shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear?" And Abram said unto God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." And God said, "Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And as for Ishmael," he didn't leave him out, "I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful, and I will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year." And he left off talking with him, and God went up from Abraham. So, there's some more I wills here. He gave promises to Sarah, and he also gave promises concerning Ishmael, the son that Hagar bore to Abraham. So, did Abraham just say, wow, all these promises, all these I wills, oh, I'm just going to bask in all of these I wills. These are just so good. I'm enjoying these I wills. Oh my gosh, I can just picture these I wills. I can just picture all these things God is saying. Oh my word, these are good. Sometimes God speaks to us. He gives us a word through a prophet, a pastor, and it's like it is something that we can hardly even imagine because we don't see ourselves in that light. Said, I'm gonna make a great preacher out of you, Mr. Garnett. And you're like, who, me? No way. You know, he might call you to be a prophetess. You never know this. He might call you to be an evangelist. And you're like, who, me? I can't even speak. My words kind of tumble over each other, and I'm trying to get the sentences out. Are you serious? No, Lord. He might call you to do something that is just completely out of your comfort zone. And you're just saying, well, That's amazing. Who, me? And you're just basking in that. You say, wow, I guess this is good. I don't know about this one, but that's good. Maybe one day, maybe, just maybe one day, you never know. And we can bask in them. Now, did Abraham bask in these I wills and God's promises and just sit down there and just say, well, it's all good. God said he's going to do it. That's good. It's just going to happen. Not really. He began to put things into motion, like the locomotive, a little bit at a time, right? Sometimes we feel we have to go, gung-ho, and we have to have everything in place. We start off with a little bit, and we hear the chugga 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 chugga, and the more we put, then it becomes chugga 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 chugga, and then the whole engine is moving. And we're like, oh my gosh, this thing is taking off. How is that? How is that? He began to put things into motion like the locomotive. Let's look at verses 23. We're staying in Genesis today. You notice that? The first book of the Bible. Good place to stay, right? Verses 23 to 27.
And Abraham took Ishmael, his son, and all that were born in his house, and all that were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the selfsame day, as God has said unto him. And Abraham was 90 years old and 9, when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael's son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. In the selfsame day was Abraham circumcised, and Ishmael's his son. And all the men of his house born in the house and bought with money of the stranger were circumcised with him.
Good. Thank you. He didn't just bask in the I wills and the promises and say, maybe one day, maybe one of these fine days, this is going to really happen, and I'm just going to see the seed that God was telling me about, nations coming from me. Maybe one day, never know. It will just happen just like that. No, he decided to connect with God's will, so he did something about it. There's a scripture that says faith without works is what? Dead. So when God gives a word to us, it might seem like it's so far-fetched, Mr. Garnett. It's like we can't wrap our minds around it. So, but if we say, okay, we're gonna act on it because God said it, and He knows a lot better than I do. I'm gonna act on it. I'm gonna do it by faith. Don't know how it's gonna work out, but since He said it, I'm just gonna do it. So Abraham went ahead, and he did all that God told him to do in verses 9 to 14 that you heard earlier about that covenant, that agreement that he was going to make with him, and this is what he should do. He got up. He said, today's the day, boys. Get ready. We're going to do this. Yeah, we'll be in pain, but guess what? We will be healed after a while. It's okay. We're going to do this. And I can imagine some, maybe even Ishmael could have been like, Daddy, what you doing? What? And some of the servants must be like, really? I think I need to quit today. Just give me my wages and send me on my way, please, because I don't think I want to go through this. Hello. But they all submitted. And I'm sure Abraham must have been the first one because he was that example, right? And so he decided, this is it. And they were circumcised. Just the way God said it was to be. It was God's will. He connected. Abraham said, I'm not going to lose this opportunity. No way. Even if I have to go through this, and it will be painful, since God said it, might not make sense to me. But since he said it, and since he's expressing his desires for my life, and he's expressing it this way, this is what I'm requiring you to do, I'm going to do it then. I'm going to just go ahead and do it. Because in doing it, it's going to now begin to set into motion the plans, the aspirations, the goals, the purposes that he has for my life. If I don't do it, then I'm going to miss out on all these things. This thing that would connect to the other thing, that would bring about this other thing happening, that would end up bringing about the finality of everything concerning that plan and that purpose that he has for me. I will miss out on that because I'm not connecting with his will. See? See how that machinery comes into place? In chapter 18, verses 1 to 15, we're not going to read all of that, but I'm just going to paraphrase, so you can still put up verse 1. But Abraham has a visitation, and he entertains these visitors, right? These are heavenly beings. He sees them as men who have come. They just turn up on the scene. They just turn up on the scene, and he sees these men. And of course, when people come to your home, usually visitors, family or friends, you offer them something to eat or to drink. And so that's what he did. He said, let me lay some things out before you. So these three men came, and of course, he bowed, he greeted them and everything like that. And let's read. It says, "My Lord, if now I have found favor in thy sight." He's speaking to these three men as if it's just one person, because really and truly that was a visitation from the Lord. "Pass not away, I pray thee, from my servant." So he goes on, and of course, he's washing their feet. Back in those days, they wore sandals. And because of how dry the land was and dusty and all of that, their feet would get really, dirty, have all those, the dust and debris or whatever it is on them from traveling. So they said, let me wash, let's wash your feet. He got his servants to bring water, wash your feet, etc. And they sat under the tree. Go on. Gave them food, as I said. All right. Go on, next verse. Let them rest a little bit. Abraham hastened unto Sarah, and of course she needed some cakes, and later on you see they killed the calf and dressed it, okay, gave them butter, milk, what have you, and they ate. All right, move on. And so these men, which really was God himself, the Lord himself appeared to him, said, "Where is Sarah? Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "Well, she's in the tent." Okay. And we heard this before. This is chapter 18. Here, God is confirming what he told him before. Isn't God just wonderful? I don't know, maybe sometimes he sees that we're beginning to doubt a little bit. Time is passing, and we're like, well, I thought God said he was going to do this for me, and I thought God said, that he was going to move this thing and out of the way so that things would be easier for me. And I thought God said, he knows our hearts. Without speaking a word, God knows our thoughts. I mean, it's amazing. It doesn't even make sense to try and hide anything from God. It does not make any sense at all. He knows our thoughts even before we think them. He knows every word before we even speak it, because he's God. So he's looking in our hearts, and sometimes he sees that maybe we might need some encouragement along the way. So here he comes again. He's confirming what he said before in chapter 17. He said, "I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son." And Sarah heard it in the tent door which was behind him. She did something now, next verse, that Abraham did earlier. Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So she was at the age where, childbearing is basically out of the question. Therefore, what did Sarah do? She laughed. Really? Really? She laughed within herself. She didn't laugh out loud, but she did one of those that I just did inwardly. She said,